Chapter 17. In any war, warriors die, innocents die. My brother is in a war with the monster. There have been many deaths. There will be many more. It is the nature of war. The cool breeze from the air conditioning filled the red sports car, keeping Jay Newport and Scott Richards comfortable in the hot desert evening. Jay's stereo played one of his favourite tapes, the best of the Bee Gees, loud enough to drown out the sounds of the motor. Scott hated the tape and the group, but over the long trip from Phoenix, they had agreed to alternate music. At the moment, it happened to be Jay's turn, and Scott was doing his best to ignore the awful sounds. Jay had the classic look of a television anchorman. His thick brown hair, even in the wind, always seemed to be in perfect order, and his brown eyes were full, almost doe-like. Cameras loved him, but television station executives hadn't liked his attitude so far. He wanted to be in charge, and usually acted as if he knew everything. It was the worst attitude a young anchor could have, forcing Jay to remain in the lower levels of the industry, looking for that big break that would jump him up. So far, he hadn't found it. Scott was the opposite of Jay. He worked simply for the money, running cameras and equipment because it was easy for him to do. His true love was his art, a complex mix of pottery and sculpture that hadn't sold, as of yet. But every spare minute he kept at it, knowing his work would someday be discovered. In the meantime, he worked at the station and did his best to avoid trips like this one with Jay. This trip would make him avoid any that required a lot of driving. Next time, he would insist on flying. The best of the Bee Gees was bad enough, but when it was combined with Frampton Comes Alive and Barry Manilow's greatest hits, it made the experience into a 70s flashback that was driving Scott crazy. He was trying to counter it with Smashing Pumpkins, Nirvana, and Hole, but somehow that didn't annoy Jay, although he would find reasons to stop more often when Scott's music was on. Scott could use a stop now. It had been over 2 hours, and the warm Diet Coke he had bought south of here was long gone. All he wanted was a meal and a place to sleep, even though he suspected the brothers Gibb, and not Courtney Love, would be providing the soundtrack for tonight's dreams. Jay had picked Agate off a New Mexico map as the place to stop. It was one of the few towns near Cole Army Base. Scott sincerely hoped that Agate wasn't one of those one-horse towns so common in the high desert, but he really didn't want to backtrack. They were going to try to get inside Army lines around Cole Army Base. Jay needed footage, and he brought Scott, who'd actually had some journalism experience under combat conditions in the Gulf. That was before he decided to concentrate on his art. He wished Jay didn't know about it, though. Jay figured that if Scott had gotten behind military lines in the Gulf, where the restrictions were tough, he'd be able to do the same in the States. The problem was that Jay wanted Scott to take him along for the ride. Scott suspected that they wouldn't get in, but he didn't know how to tell Jay. He was waiting until they pulled into Agate before he broached the topic. Although he had to admit, the next day wasn't his highest priority at the moment. It had been bothering him that they hadn't seen any traffic for hours now. Jay had explained it away simply. Would you want to drive to the site of the recent explosion? But Scott didn't buy it. After all, tons of folks drove to see the mess around Oklahoma City after the bombing, and that was before they knew what had caused it. They should have been passing a small contingent of sickos, wackos, and the unrelentingly curious. And then, added to that, the dramatic outpouring of cars they had seen that morning, cars with everything from chairs to bed frames tied to their hoods, made it all seem more dangerous than they had anticipated. Scott didn't like this, and as they reached the edge of Agate and didn't see anyone moving in the streets, he liked it even less. Man, this place looks like it's been abandoned, Scott said, turning down the music as Jay slowed to Agate's posted 35 miles per hour speed limit. It's only a little past 9. Jay said. "Even these local yokels don't roll up the sidewalks this early." The sidewalks, hell. The sidewalks had debris on them. Dolls, bits of clothing, loose papers. The streets were completely empty. "No cars," Scott said, his voice suddenly very soft. "There aren't any cars anywhere." "Shit," Jay said, looking both left and right, staring into the night. "You're right." The door of a place called Ben's Saloon was swinging back and forth in the slight wind. It was an eerie look, like someone was still there, trying to get in and out. "This town has been abandoned," Scott said. "Why?" "And there's our story," Jay said, pounding on the steering wheel with his fist and laughing. "We fell right into it." "Yeah," Scott said. "That's one perspective." He could think of 100 others. Like the fact that he should have been paying more attention to his feelings on that empty highway. "You know," Scott said, "there are times when you've got to trust your gut. My gut says that this is a story we can sell to the network," Jay said. "Maybe," Scott said, "but the entire town's abandoned. Don't you think the network would have been here for a story like that? CNN would have." "If they knew," Jay said. "Yeah, that's another perspective." "You keep saying that," Jay snapped. "Why?" "Because," Scott said, "even the network would keep its reporters away from a place giving off high levels of radiation." "Nah," Jay said, brushing aside Scott's comment with a wave of his hand, like brushing away a fly. He slowed the car down to a crawl to stare at the abandoned storefronts. "I checked the winds over Cole and they're all heading the other direction. Even if there was radiation, it wouldn't be coming here." "So why is everyone gone?" Scott asked. "When we know that," Jay said, "we have our story." Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Scott caught movement. He slowed the car to almost a crawl between the two-story buildings that lined the main street of Agate. "Did you see something?" Jay stared in that direction that Scott was looking, then shook his head. "Nothing." Then Jay laughed. "You must be seeing ghosts or..." A huge creature jumped out from the shadows, landing right in front of the red sports car. "Holy jumping shit!" Jay shouted. "Get us out of here!" Scott yelled. Jay slammed his foot on the gas, sending the car fishtailing ahead, around the monster, who just stood there, staring at them through a helmet-like face mask. Scott got a sense of broad strength and power and incredible size, before he turned his head back to see why the damn car was fishtailing. The back end of the car spun wide, then Jay recovered, and the car shot ahead. "What was that?" Scott shouted. He glanced around, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, the creature jumped in front of the car again. The thing was huge, and it had talons. "How in the hell did he do that?" Jay shouted as he swerved the car to the right, jumping up on the curb to miss the creature. The rear of the car clipped a garbage can, and Jay fought to keep it accelerating ahead. Scott was bracing himself against the dash. In all his years, he hadn't been this scared. He wished he were driving. He could have at least got them out of there. "Don't hit that thing!" he yelled. "I won't!" Jay screamed back. "And don't stop!" Scott squinted. The creature was gone. "Why the hell would I stop?" Jay yelled. Again, the creature landed in front of the car. "Shit!" Jay shouted, yanking the car to the right, just barely missing the creature. The sports car bumped up onto the curb, and before Jay could get it back under control, it plowed into a light pole and mailbox, sending letters spraying into the hot air like snowflakes. The airbags on both sides instantly inflated, saving both Jay and Scott's lives. But before either of them had a chance to react, A clawed fist smashed through the driver's side window and grabbed Jay. Scott watched in shock as his companion was yanked like a toy through the window and smashed down onto the hood of the car. A moment later, the creature had cut off Jay's head and held it up to the sky, as if presenting tribute to some unseen god. In the headlights of the car, Scott could see the shock frozen on Jay's face, the sudden meeting with death in his eyes. It was not a look that Scott would soon forget, if he lived long enough to have time to remember anything. He didn't know if it was better to get out of the car or to try and hide inside. He was no match for that creature, and he didn't think the car would move. Suddenly, the street in front of Scott lit up. Through the glare, he could see army Humvees and half a dozen men, all heavily armed, facing the monster. One man stood in the rear of the lead vehicle. He was holding an anti-tank missile launcher. "You just bagged your last trophy," he said. "Now it's my turn." The man fired just as the creature in front of Scott jumped, Jay's head held tightly in its hand. The missile cleared the hood of Jay's car by inches, missing the creature and exploding in the building behind Scott. The force of the blast sent Jay's car rolling into the street. All Scott could do was hang on and hope the seatbelt held. It did, and the car ended up on its wheels, facing the action. The monster landed on its feet, and with a smooth move, an almost major league pitcher move, threw Jay's head at the Humvee. Jay's face smashed into the windshield. The driver yanked the wheel hard sideways, rolling the vehicle and spilling the three men inside onto the concrete. Then the creature, at impossible speed, turned and headed down the street. "Kill that thing!" one soldier on the ground shouted as he rolled over and came up with his gun in hand. A roar of machine gun fire broke out, filling the canyon between the buildings with bone-jarring sound. Scott watched as the bullets tore up a nearby building, missing the creature as it leaped onto the roof, and was gone. "Hold your fire!" another voice shouted, and the intense noise stopped. Scott couldn't believe it was over. He just sat there, stunned, a cut on his head bleeding down his cheek, the deflated airbag draped over his legs. The lights on Jay's car were still on, and one beam spotlighted Jay's head, sitting upright in the middle of the street. His nose was smashed slightly, and some teeth were missing, but it looked as if every hair was still in place. Slowly, Scott started to laugh, softly, to himself, as the relief flooded over him. He was still laughing, or was he crying, as two of the soldiers came over to help him out of the car.